good evening. Welcome to the third session of this series, Political Partitions, Human Stories. We have with us this evening Aamer Hussein joining into this conversation, into this discussion. The session is titled The Sound of Falling Leaves, Qurratulain Hyder's Narratives of Dispossession. First of all, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who is here. And on behalf of History for Peace, I'd like to say that we're very, very grateful that Aamer Hussein has agreed to do this with us this evening. Thank you so much. It's an honor for me to welcome you here, sir. So before we begin, a few lines on Aamer Hussein. Though most of us who have read Qurratulain Hyder's works will know who he is, yet a few lines, as the rule goes, I must say. So here it is. Aamer Hussein is a short story writer, a novelist and essayist, holding writing fellowships and having judged prestigious literature awards, including the Commonwealth Prize, the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, among several others. He writes in both English and Urdu. In his presentation, he will be discussing aspects of exile following partition, as depicted in Qurratulain Hyder's novels and short fiction, particularly the collection, The Sound of Falling Leaves. So I'm going to keep it short at this point and give it over to you, sir, and we'll return to, one little bit about the format. So he's going to deliver his talk, following which we'll take a few questions, as many as time permits, and then we'll see how it goes. Over to you.
Well, hello all. It's still afternoon here. I'm speaking to you from semi-quarantine in London. I officially came out 5 days ago, but things are getting worse here, so we tend not to leave the house very much. So it's I'm glad to be in virtual company. Of course, it's both an honor and a hugely difficult task to talk about Qurratulain Hyder, who was, to my mind, one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century, the last part of the 20th century, certainly in Urdu. But towards the end of the decade, the last decade of the 20th century, she came into her own also as a very well-established writer in English, which changed the parameters of her reputation because so many South Asian readers who didn't have any access to Urdu and had been starved for translation came to her work via mostly her own versions of her Urdu novels. So let us first mention among those Fireflies in the Mist, which was the first major work she chose to render into English. She never thought of her English novels as being translations or direct translations of the Urdu. She always thought of them as being new versions and fresh books. Having said which, we then move on to Alcaderia, which she translated as River of Fire, rewrote as River of Fire. And the last time I met her, I'll talk more about my own acquaintance with her in a couple of minutes. She told me that River of Fire was the definitive version and not Alcaderia. If it were ever translated into any other language, she would prefer to use the English. She would prefer that the English version, River of Fire, was used. And indeed, the Italian translation of Alcaderia, or River of Fire, was from the English version. Some lines were lost in the English version, which means that she had re-examined what she felt at the time she wrote the book and felt that history perhaps had taught her new lessons. And she abandoned some of the more tragic lines in the book. I'm going to look mostly today, given the time we have, at the English versions of her work. It makes it more convenient. Also, if I can juggle my laptop and read some excerpts of her work, I'll be trying to do that as well. Then at the same time as Fireflies in the Mist, more or less, came an English collection of her short stories, The Sound of Falling Leaves, which was mostly based on her selection in Pathjhar ki awaz, a stunning collection of short stories. And I'll be looking at some of those as well. Those are translated by various hands, and in fact, one of the best stories, the title story, Pathjhar ki awaz, of Sounds of Falling Leaves, is not translated by Qurratulain Hyder. I don't know why she chose not to translate it herself, because it's one of the most beautiful short stories I've ever read. Maybe she kind of wrote it in Urdu and then broke the mold. Whereas through most of her life, as she lived between different countries, she also lived between different languages and moved back and forth between English and Urdu with, I think, equal fluency and equal ease. there's a beauty to her English prose, I find, which is quite incomparable because it's so unique, it's so much her own. I don't say that she was better or worse than any other, she just was her own model and set, I think, and she was an inspiration for many of us who read her in English. I first met Qurratulain Hyder in, I believe, 1967. And she had just moved from imprint magazine to the Illustrated Weekly of India. She was living and working in Bombay. I had come to visit my aunt there. And as it happened, I then went to school in India for 2.5 years. And she regularly sent me, at that age that I was, 12 to 13 to 15, cuttings, magazines, and so on and so forth. So it was through her that I learned a lot about, let's say, the life of Ghalib, whom I knew as a poet, but I didn't know his biography. I learned about people like Bal Gandharv and so many others. I mean, this woman had an erudition which was phenomenal. So here was this kind of adopted aunt who was educating me from a distance. And I had a chance to meet her from time to time when I saw her in Bombay. I knew at the time that she had lived in Karachi for a very long time, from partition until the early 60s. And at some point from London, she moved to India. There was a big political drama made by many of her admirers and some of her detractors about why she had moved. But she always said it was a personal choice and not dictated by the banning of a book or anything like that. Because whereas there was quite a lot of abreaction to Alcaderia, she said there was no official ban of any sort. She just didn't get the awards that other writers were getting and so on for that book. And in fact, it may have been seen to have contentious material. So in fact, Alcaderia becomes two different novels. It becomes an Urdu novel written and published in Pakistan for a mainly Pakistani readership at the time. And then it becomes a classic Indian novel of the turn of the millennium. So there are these two positionings from which we look at it. One is written a decade after partition and full of the wounds of partition. The other one is looking back at it from a vantage point of 70 years or so, 60, 70 years. So that's the story of that. But Qurratulain Hyder always called Alcaderia, or the reaction to it, her albatross. And she wanted to be seen as a writer of many other works. And in fact, she excelled herself with Fireflies in the Mist and then two other major Urdu novels that followed that, Gardish-e-Range Chaman and Chandni Begum. Chandni Begum has recently been translated after her death and published a couple of years ago. There was an earlier one called My Temples Too, Mere Bhi Sanam Khane, which she translated herself exquisitely, which is resonant of that first pain felt by people who were watching partition as it happened. It is entirely located in India, but this partly nostalgic portrait of a fading class in Lucknow or northern India becomes actually a searing picture of partition and what people underwent during those years or those months that led up to the division of the country into independence. And as she always did, she moved between communities with great fluency, great ease. I compared the last chapters of her English version and her Urdu version. All the pain is there in the Urdu version. It is so prescient. She saw so much of what was to come in terms of the agony that people might undergo. What we tend to forget, and which we see a lot of in River of Fire, is that the book is not only about people leaving or about their nostalgia for the place they left behind. Much of it is about people resettling, what she called, in fact, the stateless people, and how they found a state or how they found a home in Pakistan. So those people who come with their baggage of nostalgia, or on the other hand, stripped of all their luggage because they've left everything behind, find themselves resettling, relocating, finding new opportunities. In many cases, we have stories of people who come to Pakistan and find jobs that they might not have in India. There's also a lot about closure and about how people have to leave. And I'll come to this in a minute with an earlier story. The closure of people who find themselves in positions where Pakistan is the only place for them to go because somehow doors are shutting in their faces in India. Annie herself never talked, let me refer to her as Annie from time to time because I called her Aunt Annie. She herself from time to time refers to her own leaving, but she presents it as something very unproblematic. It was just something that happened. She got on a plane and she went to Pakistan, and that was it. Probably because her brother was going and her mother wanted to be with her brother. So she lives a fairly sparkling and elite life there, which comes through in many of her stories, to the extent that a novel like Safina has been said to be just a portrait of the glittering jeunesse dorée, the glittering youth, and the anglicized class in Pakistan, whether they were migrants or whether they were people who lived there. But then she went on to produce much, much darker narratives. The first of these was in 1955, the long short story or novella, Exiles in English, 1955, the year I was born. And I was never quite able to get from her the information as to whether she first wrote this in English or whether she wrote it in Urdu, but it seems to have been pretty simultaneous, because it was published as a very slim book in Pakistan in 1955. That narrative turns what we think of as partition narratives on its head a bit. And she kept on doing this in her short fiction, because the actual transition from India to whatever you might call abroad, to what you might call otherwhere, is so smooth that suddenly, both smooth and disjunctive, because you'll find the first chapters of her novel or novella set in India, and then suddenly those characters are in another place. So those two lines that take you away, in one way, seem to be almost underwritten. In another way, you read on and you get this incredible disjunction. Either the pain of those who find themselves nowhere or citizens of nowhere, or the canniness, the practicality of those who decide to find their ground under their feet, very, very solid and very stable and very sturdy. Jalawatan or Exiles is, for me, the beginning of a story of different kinds of pain and agony, because we have exiles not in Pakistan, but in London. And here in London, we meet people working for the radio, going to university, looking for jobs, suddenly finding themselves stranded, as in the case of one of the heroines, Kishwari. It's actually a multi-perspective story. In 50 pages, she actually tells us the stories of partition, dispossession, exile, resettlement, from many points of view, Hindu, Muslim, even British in some ways. We find this group of people who suddenly find, for one reason or another, that they can't go home or that they won't go home. And let me see if I can manage to read you some passages from this just to illustrate what she's doing. And you see that this, very young woman who wasn't quite 28 perhaps when she wrote it, deals with this subject. Just two passages. I'm going to be disjunctive about the passages as well, because a novel or novella is told in this disjunctive way. Elder sister's extreme realism annoyed Kishwari because she had never pondered over the Pakistan problem from this particular angle. And why has Baba tied himself down to India? What invisible bond is this? He could easily travel by air. As for his principles of nationalism and so on, the entire town knows Baba's political beliefs, and yet the police does not stop bothering him. All those people in power who used to be his great friends, they have turned hostile. Why? Why? Ajaib Singh Chauhan spent evenings here reciting Urdu poetry with Baba. Even he sent a search party as though we had hidden arms and ammunitions in our house. She felt a heartbreaking compassion for her father. Poor Baba, my poor innocent, naive, it should be, idealist Baba. Deputy Sahab's financial situation was deteriorating. Asghar Abbas could not send him money from Pakistan. His tenant farmers had occupied his agricultural lands. He could not get justice from the civil court. Elder sister-in-law had spent all her capital in the years-long litigation with little mother. I'll skip ahead a bit. Kishwari was horrified. She decided to stay on in India and began looking for a job. At one place, she was told the post was vacant, but the uprooted, penniless Sharanarthi girls, Hindu and Sikh refugees from Pakistan, were given a preference, which was only logical and just. It is obvious that you're staying back because of some personal problem. The moment you get a chance, you'll also migrate. She wandered around being interviewed in various offices and dejectedly took the next train home. One day her mother said, "Where is Kame's uncle, Aftab Bahadur? Go and meet him. He's an influential person and a gentleman. Ask him to get you a job somewhere." Aftab Rai, where was he? There had been several wild rumors about him. He had become a fire-eating communist and had made a hair-raising speech and was arrested and imprisoned in Ahmedabad. Move forward a bit. It's a long story. Here we come to a character called Kamal Kumari Jain, who's in London in the early 50s. And we see how also the Indian friends and colleagues of Kishwari are feeling a sense of unease, which is always phenomenologically presented and not analyzed. So it's up to us to immerse ourselves in the waters of that past and feel along with the characters what their sense of dispossession was. So here we go. The carol singers in the street had moved on towards the heat. Now, Aftab Bahadur, let us reflect. What are you today and what am I today? Is this all right? Does it make sense? Do you happen to know what kind of exile I am? I have been banished to live in the cocktail circuit. You had said once that we girls prefer only those who are in the social register. What curious logic yours was. You wanted to be the winner. You wished to win anyway. All your theories and philosophies, what the hell did they come to eventually? What are you doing now? Browsing in libraries all day long, writing another book? Had you also become a Mahaguru like D.P. Mukherjee, as was predicted by your friends? Perhaps he's got married. Who is she? What does she look like walking along him? Morning comes, then evening, life's come to an end, life's come to an end. A little further down, we have Kishwari telling her story of displacement. When I did not get a job, I tried for overseas scholarships. Eventually, the British Council gave me a stipend. When I told Baba, he became very silent, did not utter a word. I was still on the high seas when I received a cable from home that he was dead. Kishwari's voice trailed off as she began raking the embers in the fireplace. Let us go to a midnight mass, Rosemary suggested quietly. She picked up her sketchbook and pencil. Let us go to the cathedral. Once I saw a pale Hungarian girl who sat there motionless, rosary in hand, lost in prayer. I hid myself behind a pillar and sketched her. When it was exhibited, the reactionary organizers of the art gallery changed the title to Thanksgiving for the Attainment of Freedom. Tonight I will make some more sketches of the exiles' faces of despair and hope. Do you know why I'm suddenly talking to you like this? Kishwari asked her leftist English friends. Everybody feels happy to meet a long-lost buddy. But you can have no idea how pleased I was to run into my old enemy Kame. I did not know that she was here too. She was coming out of a high street shop accompanied by a tall man. I called out her name and ran towards her. She looked at me blankly. She had grown very fat. I gushed spontaneously in our dialect and asked her if she recognized me. Yes, she said coldly, yes, I have recognized you. This is my husband. He smiled amiably and said namaste. I said, namaste, bhai sahab. You're a Pakistani. You should not say namaste, Kame said sarcastically. I felt rebuffed. Her husband seemed a sensible man. He said politely, Behenji, we're in a hurry just now. Do come over someday. We live round the corner. They did not stop to give me their address or phone number and briskly walked on. Bye-bye Kame, I uttered foolishly. I did not even care to tell her that I was not a Pakistani. It made no difference. I won't make an emotional speech lamenting the loss of old values, etc. Are you not tired of repeating the platitudes for the last 5 years? Towards the end comes an epiphany, but it's in a way a sad epiphany, when they're watching the exiles of another place, of another country, leave a church after a service. And it's one of the most beautiful passages in Qurratulain Hyder's writing. Bells began to chime in the distance. They came out of Rosemary's house and turned towards the cathedral. The shadows of our follies walk ahead of us. The night is at our heels, but we're trying to cross the valley of the shadow of death as best we can. All around us are multitudes of men and women who bewail their fate hard. The winding paths of joy await us. In the stillness of the night, only the footsteps of death were audible, inscrutable that which suddenly appeared and accosted us. But we will bypass it and move on laughing. Listen, we have complete faith and conviction born of that love which some even call treason. This treason or treachery is nothing but a longing for the fragrance of jasmine blossoms. They kept walking towards the cathedral. So we have, towards the end of the story, this sense where the internal exile of her characters joins the external of exile of people they're looking at through a window. And we don't know who's going home, where that home is going to be. We imagine that Kishwari's future actually will always be as someone who feels sort of in between and lives on in England. As you might know, there were writers like Aamer Hussein who never quite chose one country over the other. She went back and forth between India and Britain, but she also had some links to Pakistan and decided she couldn't go back to a divided land, what she called a broken heart, and what she called dil tukre tukre jina, living with a heart in pieces. So Qurratulain Hyder has captured this incredibly 8 years after partition and many, many years before. The whole grand narrative of partition began to be restaged by younger writers, many of whom had not experienced it at all. This is someone speaking in the first person. I talked about the incredible ease with which Qurratulain Hyder just flicks from India to Pakistan, and then comes the story called The Sound of Falling Leaves, which really seems much more to be, in some ways, a kind of feminist narrative, which is told from an anti-feminist or non-feminist perspective of a young woman who goes through 3 love affairs, and one of those love affairs brings her to Pakistan, where her fiancé is meant to meet her, and she ends up as a chemistry teacher. Now, the furthest thing away from Qurratulain Hyder you can imagine someone being is a chemistry teacher, and yet she gets this voice of this Tanveer Fatma so beautifully, a voice that says, I'll just paraphrase here, that I don't read grand, philosophical narratives, I don't read literature, I'm just a maths teacher, I'm just a chemistry teacher, etc. But the way she presents, and this translation is not hers, I just wonder how it would have been had she translated it herself, but nevertheless, let me just show you the way she does it. And I think for so many people who experienced it, partition was like that. People, middle-class people, educated people, it just kind of took them from one place to another, and they barely knew what was happening to them. They just suddenly found themselves relocated. That was the time communal trouble started in Delhi. Soon it had spread everywhere. Farooq wrote to me in Meerut that I should leave immediately for Pakistan, where he planned to join me later. I was already thinking of doing just that. Father was crazy with worry. He didn't want me to stay in India where the honor of decent Muslim girls was going to be in constant danger. Pakistan for him was different. It was an Islamic country. Because of our property, Father could not leave Meerut. My 2 brothers were still in their teens, and after mother's death, Father had sent them to my aunt in Hyderabad. Then the results were announced. I had passed, but just barely. It broke my heart. And so when there was a lull in the riots, I took the first available flight to Lahore. Farooq came with me. He planned to open a branch of his business in Lahore. It was to be in my name, and I was to marry him there. He had no intention of leaving Delhi permanently, for his father was a fanatic nationalist. Instead, Farooq intended to visit Lahore every month or so. Lahore was just a big mess at the time. If you knew the right people, you could get the finest of homes, abandoned by the Hindus, allotted to yourself. But Farooq did not know a soul there. The most he could manage was a small house in Santnagar, which he got in my name. There he set me up, and in order to provide me company, had the family of a distant relative move in with me. They had come to Lahore from India as refugees and had no other shelter. The change in my life was sudden and drastic. It left me stunned. I just could not understand what had happened. One moment there had been my gay and abundant life in undivided India. The next I found myself in a dark and dingy house in the Lahore of 1948. I was in such a state of shock that I did not even try to find a job. Not that I was short of money at the time. Before going back to Delhi, Farooq had deposited 10,000 rupees in a bank in my name. Only 10,000 when he himself was a millionaire. But at the time I was too numb to think. Even now, few things make sense to me. Tanveer Fatma then becomes a teacher in a girls' school and eventually ends up running a dance school with her 3rd lover who becomes her husband. But you see the way she got this sense of dispossession, but also inevitability, the sense of moving from one place to another, the sense of finding a new land under your feet, a sense also that this was not going to be permanent, that people were going to be coming and going, especially she's talking, of course, about Farooq, he's Muslim. But as a very small child in Karachi, Pakistan, I experienced a lot of Hindu Sindhi families who used to come back and forth right until the early 60s to visit their relatives. They just had never thought that Karachi was going to be, you know, as it were, taken away from them. So instead of writing about the caravans of Hijrat, which so many writers have done very well, the caravans of refugees, she talks a lot about these people who might have migrated comfortably, who might have migrated on chartered flights or just been pushed on the first available plane and didn't suffer along the way, but found themselves with this constant sense of, where am I? Where do I belong? And I think she saw this very much as the kind of motif, the leitmotif of life in the first 10 years of Pakistan for those who had moved there. Either this desperate, desperate desire to succeed, this desperate desire to become something, to be someone, to go home to India on holiday when they were allowed. And a lot of characters in her stories are not allowed to go back because of some kind of, you know, military connection or something like that. So she talks a lot about fractured families as well. And I believe that until the very end of her writing life, Chandni Begum, she was still concerned about these fractured families and how relatives changed so much, you know, and how they could meet across the border to begin with, but very often later they had to meet in other places, let's say the Gulf or England, a neutral place, as it were. So all these things are signaled in these early stories of hers. And to me, even now they appear so prescient as someone born after partition, to be able to understand what was happening on both sides and to, let's say, both communities. And perhaps the community that later she saw as more vulnerable, the Indian Muslims, how she foresaw what might be their future in a land where their numbers were diminished, or their culture had purportedly been carried away to another land and had no roots anymore in the land to which it belonged. And I think in Chandni Begum, she desperately tries to recover the roots in Lucknow of a mixed culture, or of a history, or of an architectural tradition, or of a social tradition, or in one of the stories that I was reading here last night, or actually in River of Fire, which I might turn to in a few minutes. She was talking about a man from India who meets a migrant to Pakistan, and the both here, I think Mayamuri Men, Hima Kyle, and they both are delighted by the language of it in a way that the Pakistani compatriots of Kamal Reza can't be, because they don't know what it's all about, and they don't know about this, you know, mixed culture of the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb that Annie was such an advocate of, that Qurratulain Hyder, you know, rejoiced until the end of her life. So that's this stunning story, which has many other things in it. It's about women in partition. It's about the women in partition who, having come to Pakistan, were allowed to abandon their parda. It's about women in Pakistan who found jobs for themselves when they came there in a way that the conservative families would not have allowed them to do. As you saw in Exiles, it's about people who went abroad, perhaps to Britain, and sort of saw Britain as an in-between place where they would last for a few years while, you know, until the dust settled, and then choose their way home, or find themselves in a land that to them was to be entirely and completely foreign, which to many, many, many Indians, Pakistan, particularly Karachi, was. It seemed quite alien to them to begin with, but by the time they went in the 50s, there was a large enough, I think, community of settlers or other people who felt themselves to be stateless or dispossessed, with whom they could find common cause. I'm not a bibliographer, and I'm not a social historian. I am just a writer of fiction who loves fiction, and I write about fiction as a reviewer from that point of view. So when it comes to dating works, I am extremely, extremely interested in when a certain book was written, but I don't go to great lengths to find out if it isn't available. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the tradition in Urdu of publishing new editions of books and not putting the date on them. So the version of housing society that I have first appears in the copy of Pathjhar ki awaz, that was reprinted, I think, after she went to India. But Turkey Awaz has a lot of stories in it, or certainly several key stories, that like Jalawatan or Turkey Awaz or Housing Society have a lot to do with Pakistan. So what as a younger reader I sometimes wonder about is what she wrote after moving to India about Pakistan in retrospect, what she wrote while she was still there, and what she wrote in between, put in a drawer and dusted off and then published in Pakistan. So, but Turkey Awaz is probably one of the first books she published after going to India, but Housing Society, I really don't know when it first came out. Yet it is a searing portrait of an unnamed housing society. Now, I lived in a place called the Pakistan Employees Housing Society, PCHS, Cooperative Housing Society, and that was a place which the bourgeoisie and the middle bourgeoisie and the upper bourgeoisie were attracted to PCHS because people who had migrated from UP didn't like the sea air, so they wanted to live further away. And they created this colony or society, which is still there. And it's full of gardens and flowers. I grew up, till the age of 13 in that place. So it means a lot to me as well. But she presents there two sides of her migrant characters. And this is possibly something that was always presented by her adversaries as Qurratulain Hyder's reactionary nostalgia. I don't believe it is. But what she often shows you is people who had huge amounts of property in North India who migrated and had to find their way around this jungle of a new land. And I think that, post-war, all over the world, we were looking at, new economies and new developments and the falling away of what one might call privilege. So she looks at the underprivileged who were once privileged, and she looks at the people from villages who, through education, through hard work, through perseverance, and through manipulation, greed, and in the case of women, through using a sexual ladder of mobility, came to be what they once weren't. And Housing Society is probably one of the most pessimistic of her books in this sense. I think she would have been pessimistic wherever she was. It was just one of those books that looked at the world as she saw that she had lived for a decade in this adopted land of hers, and probably examined her own privilege as a completely independent young woman, financially and economically. She had a variety of good jobs, whether they were journalistic, whether they were in the Ministry of Information, etc., etc. She was able to travel. She came to England. She went to what is now Bangladesh and wrote about that as well. And she looked at this, and it ends and concludes with what to me seems to be one of the most radical statements she made about Pakistan, because I won't name the person. It doesn't really matter. It's a bit of a non sequitur. But there was a young leftist writer and journalist who was killed in the fort of Lahore during Ayub Khan's time for radical proclamations. And in this novella, you also have one of the major characters dying as the story ends, rather like Catherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf's stories, in which people are celebrating or having a garden party or a dinner party while someone dies tragically off stage. And she has that happen here, so that her main character has died in Lahore fort while people are drinking themselves to death at a dinner party. And that, many people say, is the real story, if it was concealed or published at the time, or whatever that may be the reason for people's feeling that Qurratulain Hyder had become anti-Pakistan, which a lot of people continued to say until much, much later, when she came and went quite easily between countries and between places. It's a stunning novella, again, one that she chose not to translate herself. She handed it over to other translators. But it gives one of the most accurate pictures of what was negative in society in Pakistan at that time. And I'm not saying at all that everything was negative, but she showed a world that was fast accelerating towards greed and competitiveness and plutocracy and meritocracy in some ways, but in a very ruthless fashion. And I think that sense of ruthlessness haunted her for all her writing life. She always showed us characters who became victims of this kind of ruthlessness or of their own haplessness in the face of ruthlessness, and how they, in fact, chose to survive that. These are the stories of The Sound of Falling Leaves that I have time to look at, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have about them. I did want to turn to Alcaderia and see if there were some quotations which bear this out. You have to remember that River of Fire is not a book that's, necessarily a post-independence book, though many young readers just see it as being that. It's a book about, it's a grand narrative of many, many centuries of Indian life, of Buddhist life in India, the Buddhist era, then of the way many, many people came from Central Asia as settlers, not as colonialists. They wandered in, they found their way into various parts of India. They settled down and created a syncretic tradition of poetry, of religion, etc., etc. We all know that there's a huge interface between Sufism and Bhaktism. There are many shared features, common features, etc. So, we get products of that, like Kabir being one of the major ones, but also many, of course, of the poets whose mother tongue may have been Persian, but chose to write in the old forms of Hindi, in Braj or Hindavi, and sometimes use the Urdu script, but the language they use is the language of the people. So you have, characters like Padmavati and so many others who are portrayed in those as, the center of a Sufi examination of love. And I think that book was, The River of Fire is equally important for that reason. And the first 3 sections can be read in that way. And if you completely ignore the last one, you'll still get a fairly complete book. And then the last part of the book, which is set during independence and partition and after partition, covers 10 years after partition nearly. So it's right up to the time that she published the book. It then becomes almost a separate story, which is linked through the names of the characters and so on and so forth in very, very, very artistic and graceful ways. But each narrative can be seen as both interdependent and as what people crudely call a standalone these days. So here you have, again, another quintessential Qurratulain Hyder hero, anti-hero, because these are people who are never very sure of themselves and so on and so forth, vacillating between his longing and nostalgia for India and his determination to make something of his life wherever he finds himself. And let me look at some of the quotes here from his point of view. Now I have left her far behind and I am going home. She continues to stand in the noisy whirlpool of boundless silence, her little nose against the glass door. Why am I so tired? Let me sit down here quietly. Let me be still, said Kamal, and sat down on a rock. Like pious thieves, we evoked special devas, but our gods betrayed us, said Talat. Our thieves' kitchen has closed down. Now I remember nothing, said Kamal, raising his face. Passing years float around me like soap bubbles. Lights glisten in rain-filled streets. The moon rolls over sleeping chimneys, slipping away towards the sea. Sharp winds whistle tipsily across the southern moors. Birds of the night are circling over the still, oily waters of heaving harbors. Crowds pass by on the bridge. Canoes sail on shaded streams. I am on the shore. I have to search for a ship whose lights have gone out. A ship which will quietly enter the dark ocean, going towards a place where I have this gut feeling there is no one to say, welcome home, Kamal Raza. He stood up and started walking back down towards the street. Then he repeated, there is no one to say, welcome home. And this no one to say, welcome home refers to both India and to Pakistan. So the only home he has is within himself. A home that is history, heritage, shared relationships, shared memories. Let's move on a little bit. In another corner of the deck, a Maharashtrian woman began singing a Meera song in which the naughty child Krishan told his mother he hadn't stolen the butter. Maiya mori main nahi makhan khayo. Bhor bhai gaiyan ke piche madhuban mohe pathayo maiya mori. Kamal forgot the unexpected anguish caused by the Britain's realistic comment and was instantly lost in the song. Pandit Gaur began to beat time with his hands, and soon both he and Kamal strolled towards the singer. Each culture has its secret language, said the British poet, and Kamal and the Pandit share it. That's the whole point. If a Westerner were to write a novel about India, he probably wouldn't understand why they're both carried away by that song. Strains of a waltz floated across out of the ballroom outside an old Robert Taylor film was being shown. Kamal moved away and prowled around aimlessly, greeting some acquaintances with feeble hellos. On the deck, Sikh businessmen from Glasgow were singing Heer at the top of their voices. They also shared a secret language with the Muslims and Hindus of Punjab, and yet they had butchered one another in the riots of 1947. Politics had always been mightier than culture. So here you have her, flip the coin around. She just flips it around and shows the uniting elements, the uniting potencies of cultures, and how politics can destroy these. But she also looks at it from the 2 points of view of the divided Punjab and of the people from UP who had been divided from each other and could find common cause only in foreign lands or on short visits in their shared music. And of course, the great Aamer Hussein, who, after Qurratulain Hyder, was probably the greatest Urdu writer of the last, let's say that, the closing years of the last century, and certainly was the grand old man of Urdu literature and the first 18 years of this century, of this millennium. He always retained this very, very strong bond with Hindi. And I just remember him one day in about 1997 in Berlin, sitting with Nirmal Verma, who was about 10 years younger than him, perhaps 5 years younger. And they were kind of coming up. I'm sorry? Yeah. Nirmal Verma and Aamer Hussein sharing anecdotes that they remembered of a past that was perhaps inaccessible to so many other people around them. So she presents us with this picture, and this is her retake of it in English many years later, what she chose to keep. This is him going back from India to Pakistan. Suddenly, the other country began. The gun-toting Sikh soldiers were left behind. I'm in Pakistan. I have come from India. Refugee, Muhajir, displaced Muslim from Uttar Pradesh. How terrifying. Refugee, displaced, homeless. Abdul Mansoor Kamaluddin wept. After a few moments, he realized that his fellow passenger, the Pakistan border police officer who was returning to Lahore from Amritsar, was looking at him intently. Kamal was crestfallen. He felt as though the police officer was saying, "You still stand at the crossroads of conflicting loyalties, don't you?" The eyes of the whole world were glued on him. You're an Indian Muslim, Indian spy. The train's wheels seemed to be repeating the same refrain, traitor, spy, traitor, spy, traitor, spy. He opened his eyes, trembling. The train was slowly entering the barred portion of Lahore railway station. His heart beat faster. In the evening, he boarded the PIA plane from Lahore's Walton Airport, and he began flying towards Karachi. Now his new life lay before him. He took out his Morocco-bound notebook. What a lot of things he had to do when he got back to the federal capital. First thing, Uncle Nazir had to be asked to dine with him at the Gymkhana Club. Oh, by the way, I was just staying at the Gymkhana Club 2-3 weeks ago in Karachi. This influential relative could help him to purchase cement, etc., in the black market. He was going to build his house in a posh locality of Karachi. Cousin Munne has married the daughter of the Minister of Industries. Must remember to invite them too. Tell me, where can I go from here? He asked himself. How can I avoid becoming a part of the system? A beautiful Pashtun air hostess brought him coffee. She was impeccable in a green uniform designed by Pierre Cardin. He gave her an appreciative once-over. For a moment, he felt good and self-assured. For a brand new people, we are not doing too badly at all, thank you. He tried to shun his very negative thoughts and picked up the dawn. Soon he was engrossed in the political news of his country. Crisis in the cabinet, the prime minister resigns, a new prime minister addresses the nation in Jahangir Park. After a while, he looked out of the window. The sky was overcast. Soon it would start raining. The clouds need no passport. He drew the window's green curtain, stretched his leg, and leaned back in his seat. So you can see that with the talent of a short story writer, of course she was an epic novelist, Qurratulain Hyder is able to conflate and combine such completely contradictory emotions within the space of 2 pages. That here is this man entering the country of his adoption, which is now his country, and feeling that when he's back there, he's going to be seen as someone who has somehow been contaminated by a visit to the place of his birth. And then, in her way, she's looking at him as someone who sees upward mobility and, in a sense, a degree of ruthlessness as the only way to survive wherever we are. You know, how do we survive? If we have the economic connections and privileges, we survive through our connections. If we don't have them, we survive using our bodies, our minds, and whatever resources we have. I think I have spoken for about 45 minutes. I'm just going to cover very briefly Fireflies in the Mist. Though in a sense, it's very much part of Annie's absolutely seminal oeuvre. It deals with what was East Bengal, and then in her usual way, sometimes from a distance, she suddenly takes us to East Pakistan, which she doesn't dwell on very much. But what she does do is to end the novel in a place where one young woman, Jahanara, who's a freedom fighter, looks at her cousin, who again is one of the typical characters in Qurratulain Hyder's work. There are the idealists and there are the pragmatists. And then there are the people who somehow combine idealism and pragmatism, or betray idealism for pragmatism, which is also a very, very common theme there. And this man has trafficked with a new ruthless society in Bangladesh. And you realize that she was writing in the 70s, so this was extremely prescient. We weren't to know what was going to happen to make any of the countries of South Asia what they later were to become, for better or for worse. Things have changed drastically in my lifetime while I watch. And here is this young woman looking at her cousin and thinking, you know, what difference did this new land and the fights that we fought and the sacrifices we made make to those of us who just returned to our bad old ways? And yet at the same time, you see that she doesn't have, in the end and ultimately, Qurratulain Hyder is not a cynic, and I think I'll conclude with just a few lines from her, from a speech she made, a very beautiful speech, and that'll show us how she never actually ceased to be the idealist she was. I have traveled extensively all over the world and found human beings to be essentially the same. They have identical reactions, emotions, even the minutest of gestures and mannerisms, and yet they're so divided, and most of them so full of hatred and prejudices against other human beings. Individually, they can be friends. Collectively, they declare wars and bomb and kill. Thousands of years of religion have not really changed them. So how could 80 years of communism make any difference? The one had genuinely believed that a new, wonderful humanity had come into existence in the socialist bloc. Today, after having written a large number of short stories, a few novels and novellas, I have also come to the sad conclusion that literature, the fine arts, philosophy, notions of high culture, civilizational values, etc., really do not mean a thing to the power brokers of the world. And it is at their behest that libraries and museums are bombed, old cultures uprooted, histories and philosophies distorted to serve political ends. Humanism has failed. Still, one must not despair and must not give up the fight. Now, if she was writing this in the mid-90s, and you look back to Jalawat and Exiles, which she wrote in the mid-50s, she's saying the same thing that those characters looking at the people leaving the cathedral are saying. So that idealism never left her till the end. And it was marvelous because, I then knew her for the rest of my life. She often came and stayed in my parents' flat in London, which I occupy now. So I actually watched her write Gardish Range Chaman and parts of Chandni Begum. Finally, the last time I saw her is about a year before she died in Delhi. I had made a trip back to Delhi after many, many years of absence, where she told me what to go and read in the Jamia Millia library, books about partition I didn't know about. There were first-hand narratives, including Anis Qadwai. She said, oh, you read this stuff that young writers are writing. Go back and read the old stuff. That'll tell you much more. And I did, and it was extremely valuable. And then she looked at me one day, and we were talking about, a grand statement that some younger writer had made. And she looked at me and she said in Urdu, but I'll quickly translate it into English. What's all this about, son? You write a bit, I write a bit, so what? And there was that so what, which this great writer, it was almost the last thing she ever said to me. I never knew I would never see her again. And I just came away with that, we struggle on, but it's not for grandeur, it's not for glory. It's just to put across, this common humanity that she believed so deeply in, and I think committed herself to for all of her life, which transcended all the boundaries and the borders that she had to suffer from as much as any of us ever has had to. I think I'll leave it there and perhaps open it to questions.
Thank you so much, first of all, for this very, very engaging talk. Also, this absolutely wonderful mix that you brought of the thematics of her writing for someone like me who's not very well versed with her writing, really. It really helped me to put it in context, and also the way you located her in her own time and space, where she was writing from, the emotional value that it brought, and also the mix of your personal anecdotes with this whole thing added much more value to this entire conversation for us. So thank you. And could we now open it up to questions? If you could basically just, since we're not a very big number here, if you could bring in your questions right now, it would be good.
Comments? Readers' comments?
Okay, can I go? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so adab to everyone. I'm Armin, and I am joining from Karachi. And I just joined the session because I knew Aamer Hussein would be speaking, and I've heard him speak at my university, so Habib University. Aamer Sahab would remember. He has visited us, and I've been a student of Dr. Asif Farooqi, so there has been a lot of introduction to Qurratulain Hyder as well as Intizar Hussain, and obviously to Aamer Hussein's work as well. And in fact, I was reading Hermitage, where you write about your interaction with Qurratulain Hyder. And currently I'm taking a course taught by the poet Afzal Ahmed Sayyed, which is all about the world of Qurratulain Hyder. So this felt like a recap of my semester so far. We've covered Fireflies of the Mist, we've studied the housing society in detail, and just living in Karachi and knowing all of these realities of your city is just so important. But this session is also important to realize the overall impact of Qurratulain Hyder across geographies, across borders. She writes about Bengal, she writes about UP, she writes about Lahore and Sindh. So the recent story we are discussing is Sita Haran, which is Sita Betrayed. And it's just so fascinating that this one woman.
Your voice is failing a little bit.
Short stories, and she can write a magnificent novel. And can you hear me now?
Yes.
So yes, I'm just in awe of Qurratulain Hyder's marvel of being able to write in such intricate detail, and her knowledge of our socio-political histories And I just love this session. Thank you to the organization for having this session. And it's just wonderful that virtual spaces can bring us closer like this. So, and thank you, Aamer sir, for such a wonderful session discussing Qurratulain Hyder.
Oh, that's what my Anikhala would have loved, leave alone the grand writer Qurratulain Hyder. She would have just loved to hear someone like you say this, because she missed out on all this virtual boom. She knew nothing about it. She died in 2007, before we all became so technologically savvy, you know. She just loved to have young students sit at her knee, and she would remember their faces, and even when she didn't remember their names, and say, "Isne to mujhse ye pucha tha, isne to mujhse wo pucha tha, ha ha wo," and remember things like that in a way that she didn't remember the grand people she had met. So this is wonderful to hear, and that she that her legacy has lived on. I think that's what she wrote for, that people would look at her work and see what the past was like, and see what our present was like, our troubled present, and how it had its roots in a troubled past.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
You mentioned Aamer Hussein while you were discussing the latter half of the 20th century as one of the most important Urdu writers from Pakistan, who, if I'm correct, many of his stories go back to sensibilities of the Indian
Very much.
things that is much beyond the Afghan, Pathan, Turk migrations into the country. He was very unique in the sense that he would be talking about Jataka stories.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yes. So I was just wondering whether your readings of Hyder's work also sees this kind of tracking the Indianness or Indian sensibility. I mean, I don't know.
Certainly River of Fire does, as I think I said. That was the one in which she most immersed herself in it.
Okay. So it goes back
because, the first two chapters are basically set in pre-Muslim times.
Okay.
Believed in them. I don't think that writers like her and many others that I know today, even Nantara Segal, don't see a disjunct between those two worlds. They see that the Muslims came as, many of them came as settlers, or it's very quiet kind of Sufis who settled here and there, and that their religion very often spread peacefully and not by fire or sword. I think that was her take on it. And that one culture very often slipped very seamlessly into another. I mean, I've grown up with Kabir and Mira. I probably knew Mira's bhajans in Pakistan much before I knew Ghalib, because the language was easier for me to follow. The simplified version of Mira, and constantly chased around my mother asking her to explain that. And that was long before I read Aamer Hussein. But as far as the Buddhist tradition is concerned, or the mixed tradition, there are the Pakistani writers who look back on it. Jamila Hashmi looked back on it quite a bit as well. So he was not unique in that, but he was unique in the way he framed it, and certainly unique in the depth of his knowledge, because he came from UP and he carried that with him in a way that perhaps a writer living in Punjab didn't. They had a different, as she talks about Heer, and she talks about, Mira Bhajan.
So the reason I asked was because a lot of the historical materials that you have in Taxila and this area, in Punjab, is rooted in these sensibilities, right? So I'm wondering whether writers from there, not those coming from UP, but writers that whose homes were in that part, the Swat Valley, for example, Gandhara, this whole area, because this was like really deeply rooted in this so-called, we're going beyond the binary of Hindu and Muslim over here.
Yes, absolutely, of course. I mean, certainly in my own case, I very recently wrote a story called Hermitage, which has a sort of Buddhist background. And I got mine from 2 lines I read in a book about a Buddhist monk. And I used to tease my readers by saying, where is this set? Where do you think the story is set? And one looked up and said, well, it's set a few miles away from here. I was saying this in Islamabad. And she pointed her hand upwards. She was an Urdu poet who comes from, of Bihari origin, but who lived a lot of her life in East Pakistan, Fatma Hassan. And she just said, up there in Taxila, And I said, yes, because I had used Indic Sanskrit names, knowing the meanings of those names. You know, Trishna and so on. The names I used unconsciously were from a Sanskrit culture, not from a Thai culture. And she said, look, you know, you've actually come to this very place. It's like deja vu. So yeah, we are doing that, I think, I hope.
The name of the story?
Hermitage.
Hermitage, okay.
Unfortunately, I don't think that story has been published in India yet. Much of my work has been, but my last book didn't find an Indian publisher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I normally publish first in Pakistan and then it gets picked up by Indian publishers. This time, no go. Too esoteric, they said. So sad about that. I wish there was a way that you could access the book.
Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome.
Rajasmitha, can I go?
Oh, yes. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Hussain. It's been fascinating to hear you. I was watching you on Facebook earlier, and I joined the Zoom call now. But I'm interested in Qurratulain Hyder also because I'm kind of working on her and a bunch of other writers for my PhD. And I'm trying to think about the question of nostalgia in their writing, in the writings of South Asian Muslims. And I was wondering if you think that with Qurratulain Hyder's work, or of the other writers that we have perhaps touched upon a bit, do you think that there is a political implication to the nostalgia that they are looking at, and do you think that allows something like nostalgia to be furthered into a more potent and radical political force in their writing about the world?
Who is speaking and where are you speaking from?
It's me, Zahra, yes. I am right now in my room at St. Andrews in Scotland, but I'm from India.
Right. Okay, yeah. Zahra, if I may, no, I don't think so. I don't think they're serving that agenda. I think that they represent very, very carefully, and I was trying to say this throughout my talk, the perspectives of different people. Some who lost something behind, but it becomes irretrievable. Because by the time you read Chandni Begum, the people who go back are so firmly ensconced in their Pakistani lives that they really have, not very much traffic with the Lucknow that they visit. It's usually Lucknow they visit. They go there to buy nice things that they remember or to eat the nice foods that they remember, and they very often show off about their present lives. I think, if you take the whole ladder, particularly of women writers, even a popular writer like A.R. Khatun, what A.R. Khatun did, which was so different from some of the others, was right from the start. She was showing you these Pakistanis who made new homes for themselves. And even though she said somewhere, कि जिसके पास आम का बाग था उसने कहा कि हजार बाग थे or something like that, and got themselves new properties. She showed the ruthlessness, but she also showed the freedom. What was slightly different in her early work was that she was more positive about the migration, particularly for women. I think Khadija Mastur, moved from Angan to Basti. Basti, which has recently been translated by, is it called The Promised Land? It's been translated by Daisy Rockwell and published in India. You see, in between the first novel and the second novel, she's changed so entirely that even though she might begin in India or have flashbacks to India, she's really looking at that housing society world of Qurratulain Hyder, in which people are desperately trying to succeed, women and men across gender lines and so on, to make something of their own lives, autonomous entities, apart from political entities as well. She was of the declared leftist. Political entities of themselves beyond that nostalgia. And that nostalgia then becomes to an extent trivia as well. Not that she completely throws it away, but she says, what's the point of dwelling on what we left behind? Make something for yourselves in this land, and not just through ruthlessness, but through your commitment to a shared humanity. And that entirely restages the whole concept of nationalism. What is nationalism? How do we become patriots and not become bigots? I read it that way. Yes, in many places there is a nostalgia. I don't know to what extent you'll agree with this. There is a nostalgia, but we all have a nostalgia for what we've left behind. I mean, and I come from Karachi and I'm constantly asked, so what do you remember about the past? Do you long for the home of your past? I said, no. I mean, I've been visiting so often in the last 10 years that past for me is nearly effaced. I don't have any yearning for it. Of course, I try to remember. It might be nostalgic at times. But there are groups in Karachi that are called things like, I want my old Karachi back. And when that kind of thing is given to me, I don't want it back. Yet I do remember conversations with, sitting on this very sofa where I'm sitting now, Qurratulain Hyder saying things about a lovely Karachi of the past, how it was so clean and how it was so full of new ideals and how there were so many artists flourishing. And then when you said, what do you think of the city today? She said, well, there's so much talent there. So you see, even she was able to see it that way. I think we always look at things with double lenses, and writers have to look at things with double lenses because memory is a crucial part of our imaginative process. In fact, I think memory is probably more important than imagination. So I hope that to some extent answers your question.
Yeah, it does. No, I mean, it's interesting to hear this perspective as well, because I mean, the way that I'm looking at nostalgia is slightly different from what we commonly understand nostalgia to mean, I suppose. And I'm still trying to figure it out because I've just started it. But it's useful to...
The actual meaning is homesickness, isn't it?
I mean,
I
yes,
think the deconstructed Greek meaning is homesickness. It was an invented term from the 19th century, but...
Yes, I mean, it starts with homesickness, but I think the idea of homemaking as well, like how you look at nostalgia to make new homes, and how the kind of keeps feeding into your current identity as well. So kind of looking at that flux, and it's not necessarily a defeatist in the way that, you know, certain thinkers think about it, like Boehm and this academic called Anindya Roy Chaudhary, who's also interested in this idea. So I'm thinking about a bunch of questions, but I still don't know the answers. So it's, you know, perhaps I will discard this perspective or, you know, go forward with it. I don't know.
No,
so it's
no, you must stay with it. But reading and writing, of course, I would give you the answer in the end. I think immersing yourselves in all their perspectives and seeing what they come out with.
Yes.
You know?
It's so lovely to talk to you, Mr. Hussein, because I've been following your work.
Which city are you from?
Fantastic. I am, I grew up in I mean, like where I'm from, I was in Delhi before this. I grew up in a small town in eastern India called Ranchi. Yeah. So, but my family is from Lucknow, but my father was kind of working, he was in the forest services, so we grew up there.
Yeah. You see, there we are again, those crossed narratives of what we read and what we recognize in what we read and how we link ourselves to what we read. It's wonderful.
Yes. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions coming in?
I think there's some stuff on the chat, I believe.
I can see 6 in the chat.
Well, I can see...
I think this must be Terence Saints. Thanks for the insights into how that's worked. Does her work epitomize both the lingering historical trauma of the partition and the possibilities of resistance? Yes, I think that this has been the subtext of what a lot of us have been saying, or a lot of what I said, and I think the last conversation that we had as well, that the possibilities of resistance are very much there. Even when you see a failure, I think in the recognition of that failure of a death, the legacy of that death and the strength it gives to the people who stay behind is the resistance.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yes, Anjum?
Yeah, this is Anjum. Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
I did try to type it in the chat, but since we're asking orally, let me just put it to you. I was curious as to whether you felt there was a difference in the way Qurratulain wrote about the human impact of partition between the partition in the West and the East. You know, whether it was 1947, because East was also divided in 1947. And also, of course, 71.
Yeah.
Do you feel that?
Yeah, I think she did see the difference. I think that she saw that probably East Bengal was more secular in a way, that, you know, many people who lived on there for many years after partition were not Muslim. And in fact, the heroine of her novel is an East Bengali Hindu, caste. who then ends up in the Caribbean or somewhere because there is no home for her anymore anywhere. And that is something that's very crucial to Qurratulain Hyder's work. Many of us feel that there was a home for us elsewhere, whether in the land to which we migrated or the land which we didn't leave. For example, Ismat Chughtai, I don't think ever felt out of place in Bombay, which was in fact a place of expatriation for her. Bombay was very distant from the place she grew up in.
Right.
So she does have that. But again, having said that, there's a Yasmin, a dancer in the book, who ends up as flotsam and jetsam in Europe. So why she feels dispossessed, is it gender, is it class, or is it nation? I would say it's much more gender than anything else. So she looked at all these different things, and of course she looked at each thing in its own context. So in Sita Haran, which one of you mentioned, she's actually looking at a Sindhi Hindu who's rooted in the cultural context of Sindh, and then probably finds it becoming bifurcated, you know, as her people begin to give up a syncretic tradition. Okay. So I think she does look at the difference, of course, on a grand national scale, but I think she looks at the difference on particular individuals, the different impact on different individuals of what? Right. Not just partition, but the staging of a new kind of nationalism has on the human psyche. I think that's what she's very, very, very good at doing for me. I think each one of us, as many of you have said, there are so many different layers which we can excavate in order to understand Qurratulain Hyder's multiple messages. And I think this is one of them for me.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
I had something to ask. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, so we thinking about the last 2 points that we've been discussing, it reminded me of something that Milan Kundera mentions, that everything is illumined by the aura of nostalgia, even the guillotine. And we've also seen Joyce make certain remarks about his homeland. And looking at the characters in Qurratulain Hyder's narrative, a certain kind of quote-unquote cosmopolitanism. I don't know if the word is applicable for this context in South Asia. So I was wondering, can we locate Qurratulain Hyder as, in a continuum with authors taking a particular nuanced stance on dispossession, on travel, on cosmopolitanism, or whether she directly admits that somewhere?
Yeah, no, I don't know that she directly admitted it, but I think that she felt increasingly, I mean, from her 30s onwards, that she did come from a very particular part of India, and that didn't necessarily have to be the part where her mother and father grew up. In the same way, my mother, who grew up in Indore, always felt she belonged to Malwa, not to Ajmer, where her mother came from, or Kathiawar, where her father came from. In the same way, for Annie, it was very much Lucknow. But I think that she would never have denied the huge impact of Karachi on her, the cosmopolitanism of Karachi, miniature metropolitanism. She would never have denied her time in London. And increasingly in her last years, she saw London as a place where she felt most at home because she was able to navigate all these different waters, you know, and also meet people from every side of her cultural heritage and where they could unite and perhaps even be nostalgic together. So it was a very rooted cosmopolitanism in her case. Whereas I think when she was much younger, in her 20s, it wouldn't have been. I think she would have been more of a rootless cosmopolitan. You can see the difference in language between the opening of housing society and the chapters that describe the same place in Safina Ramedil, which has been translated as the Ship of the Heart Sorrow. One seems to be looking at it very much from a cosmopolitan, anglicized, anglophone point of view. And the other one is rooted in the sounds of the language and the smells and so on of it from which she had lived away for many years. So I think that's one answer. I think distance made her more rooted in many ways. Though she chose to live in Delhi, which was not a part of her background.
Thank you. It was such an enriching experience to attend this. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry?
It was such an enriching experience to attend the talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Very well.
Do we have more questions? Because
I can see one here from Manjima Chatterjee.
Okay.
Champa being entrapped by destiny. Champa resists by finding her own niche, doesn't she? In the place to which she belongs, she's placed as a kind of, she's positioned as a kind of counterpoint to Kamal, who decides to make a home in the new land, whereas Champa decides to put up with what she has over there, and she chooses a kind of quiet resistance, which perhaps is in keeping with some of the Sufi concepts that Qurratulain Hyder has put in her work. And, at times, people who have read her deeply have accused her of quietism, of saying that, the only way that you survive is by retreating into, the corners of your mind and your sensibility and living, being in the world, but not of it. I would say that. So I think that there's a metaphysical answer rather than a political one.
Yes, I see what you're saying. I've just always been so intrigued by the fact that she's an object of so much desire, and yet she does not seem to be capable of actually taking charge of her life.
Yeah. Was this not an early kind of feminist manifestation of what the world and patriarchy do to women, what society do, and where we get trapped, and the ways in which we can navigate, again, I keep using this phrase, the waters of politics, and the ways in which we can resist, and the ways we become defeated or are defeated, like Yasmin and Fireflies in the Mist, or the ways we survive them, like Dipali in Fireflies in the Mist and Chanda in River of Fire. So there are three different ways. One is by going abroad and finding a life for yourself elsewhere, far away from everything you once loved, and coming back only, as another great writer, Aamer Hussein, said, to touch the den, to touch the place where you once belonged. The other way is to go to your own place of birth and live there very quietly and just carry on with your life and tend your own garden. And the third way is to be killed and, sacrificed on the altar of so-called progress and modernity.
It's just, it seems like a kind of defeat.
Yeah.
And I think particularly in the present context, rereading it 20 years after I read it first, I'm still constantly struck by how alarmed I am by Champa's end. Especially when we look at how much she resists, never quite managing to do so. So yes, that was my question, I suppose. Yeah.
But she was very interested in hapless women. I mean, we also have to think of that story, Apke Janam Mohe Bitiya Na Kijo. I don't know if anyone has read that, about this woman, who is...
yes, I have read that. Apke Janam Mohe Bitiya Na Kijo.
Yeah.
Beautiful story.
Yeah. But my mother used to tell her, they were the dearest of dear friends, and she used to say, Annie, why do you make your characters suffer so much? And she would look up and say, do I? She didn't say that's life, but I could just imagine that would be the next phrase.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
I'm Arundhati Ray from Kolkata.
Uh-huh.
And a fascinating lecture from you, Mr. Hussein. And I really didn't know anything about her, but feel a little enlightened. But my question to you is, after hearing so much discussions also, that would you say there is an element of identity crisis in some of your readings, and from a personal, can it be sort of generalized?
You mean my own personal identity crisis?
Not yours, the writer.
No, I think that she's wonderful at depicting identity crisis.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's what she does very well. And I think that it's so hard. And this is a point I made early in the narrative, that when she talks about somebody like Tanveer Fatma, who just finds herself in Pakistan teaching chemistry at a girls' school and then ends up, running a dance academy and hasn't read any literature, we can't usually locate Annie in any of her narratives. There's a very one of the minor figures in Alcaderia is called Talat. And Talat she called the surrogate for herself. But Talat is just somebody who wanders around the narrative looking at other people. We never see her close up.
Okay.
For example, if you take Kishwari and Jalawatan, who's stuck between the two countries and we don't even know where she's going to go, was actually inspired by someone we both knew who spent the rest of her life in London. And only in the last few years of her life, I remember her saying, I actually now more identify with Pakistan than with India, because my India is gone. She was very good at recognizing cultural crisis.
Right. The dual culture always plays its role, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, where was I reading in one of the narratives last night? I read so many over the last few days, where one of the characters said, "At least we're Pakistani and not Palestinian."
Well, that's also sad because I've been to Palestine.
I have to.
I have seen the children. It's very sad.
I have to.
When you see them with those guns in their hands, and I have to call the police. Please protect us. We are visitors here. But then they're nowhere. I mean, nothing is being done for them. So it's a new generation growing up.
I've been in groups. We've had to run because settlers were pointing guns at us. We'd been searched at all the checkpoints. We had to walk on the other side of the road.
I felt that, I mean, it's so wrong to bring up children in that manner.
Exactly.
And in a different kind of a civilized, if we can call today ours, is a civilized world, when we allow children to suffer like that.
Well, I mean, this is one of the sad things about Qurratulain Hyder's idealism, that in the mid-90s, she was still looking forward to a civilized world, whereas she recognized.
Then I think writers are swayed to think like this.
Yeah.
No, it's something very natural human element, I would say.
Because somewhere that's the element of resistance, I think, that was addressed earlier, that we have to cling to, that we do believe the world will get better. I think in the same story, she said, "I'm like a tiny little bird reaching its claws up to hold up the sky." Just think of that. What a beautiful metaphor.
And there's so much of commonalities between the two cultures, and yet we are at loggerheads. It just amazes me. Anyway, thank you so much. Very
pleasure, of course.
Do we have any more questions coming in? Okay, then do I have time for making a quick one myself?
Of course.
So, thank you. So
5 minutes late, so it's okay.
Thank you. So you talk about how she was probably one of those very few writers who spoke about the dilemmas of those who possibly migrated comfortably, for lack of a better word, but dilemmas nonetheless, and a deep sense of loss also.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, besides the obvious material differences, what would you think is distinctive in the narrativization of the dilemmas of these people who migrated comfortably versus those who, as we know, went through all the devastating experiences of migration itself in the first place?
I think that nobody escaped those devastating experiences. We all sort of had a sense of them. And also there were all the quiet sufferings that people underwent. My own parents' experience of partition was very similar to what she describes. My father belonged to Sindh, but he was in Delhi at the time. And he was sent to Kashmir to rescue 2 of his cousins and bring them to Karachi, where their father was. And then suddenly told that his property in Delhi had been sequestered because he had become an evacuee. So it was just accidental partition. But it's not as if people weren't going out and helping refugees or working with them and so on. Yes, in privileged ways, but nobody was unaware of the fact that hordes of unsettled people were everywhere. And I think Qurratulain Hyder was acutely aware of this, because if you read that first novel, Bhi Sanam Khane, it's really about the old fort where people were just shoved away, awaiting relocation. Some of them didn't want to leave. They just thought that they were there to bide their time. So yeah, I think that she, instead of trying to be like some of the progressive writers and write from the point of view of someone who was entirely dispossessed in a way that she had no first-hand experience of, she certainly had the talent to do it. But I find that her political idealism was of a different sort, and it was brilliant, and it lasted till the end. Because she was never a fellow traveler who recanted. She was a humanist who believed in all the principles that progressives espoused, but she didn't believe in what she called Hindora Beatna, beating the drum. She said it just wasn't something she wanted to do. So you find all those things in her narratives, but you don't find this desperate desire to be the voice of the subaltern, which she would have thought was appropriation. She didn't like jargon, by the way. She hated it. I mean, I remember coming down the stairs at Sawaz one day, and she had said to me, "Ye bas jadidi aur sakhtiyat kya bala hoti hai tumhe pata hai?" She was meaning, you know, what is postmodernism and what is structuralism? And I told her, well, postmodernism and structuralism. She said, I know what it means. I'm asking you if you know what it means. So, you know, that was that. So she actually said to me, I think, she said that the way the Gulf War came home to her was one day she was in London and she switched on the television and there was this woman in a blue scarf running towards a burning house. And she said that those stories just came to her head. What is she running there to save? What is she running there to save? So it was always that woman or child or man running towards the burning house that was the starting point of her narrative. Not the grand narrative that would make her, though she was so good at grand narratives, but not the narrative that would put her into a position of actually speaking for the dispossessed. I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
Yes, it certainly does. Thank you. And finally, I think Varuna was raising her hand. Do you have a question for Sir?
I don't see anyone here. Yeah?
I saw the raised hand, but I don't think he's got a mic. There's something, there's a video, but no mic icon.
Doesn't look like there's a question from Varuna.
Okay, I mean, I'll make a concluding comment, which is that I don't think that Qurratulain Hyder would agree with everything or all my perspectives on her work. She might, in fact, radically disagree with them, but she was always, always open to argument. And she always said, you know, once I've written the book, it belongs to you, so it's up to you to talk about it. But I did try to speak to you in her voice as much as I could so that I could juxtapose my views with what she said and how I read her along with what she wrote. So, you know, if she ever contradicted me about some perspective, I could say, yeah, but you wrote this here. And then she would say, yes, but I wrote this elsewhere. So these are my characters. And I would say, yes, indeed, but it's the book that speaks to us in the end.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aamer. This has really, really been an excellent session. It's almost like, you know, not almost, more than almost like Qurratulain Hyder coming alive in front of us.
Well, you know, a personal anecdote to end with. One day she was telling me about a story of mine that she never managed to translate, though she wanted to translate it. And Femi Dariaz did it, and she said, it's about the chap tarjuma kiya. She's done a very good translation of the story. And I just turned around to her and I said, yeah, but Ani Khana, your hand was on mine when I wrote it. So when I talk about her, her hand is always on mine.
Yeah, and it's very, very apparent, yes. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you for your, you know, participation and your very exciting, enlivening questions. I didn't speak in a jargon-ridden or theoretical way. I just spoke to you very directly about what I feel, you know.
That's what was special about the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
And thank you, Anjum, for making this happen.
No problem. Not at all. You don't have to thank me. I'm sorry that there was such a glitch in the beginning, but no, it finally went off well.
Thanks, Zoom Lives.
Yeah, Zoom Lives, exactly. I mean, I missed my first lesson of the term entirely because I was trying to do it by telephone from Pakistan. And it just didn't happen. So this was quite smooth compared to many of the hazards of Zoom that I've experienced. Well, goodbye to all of you. And thank you for being part of this on a Saturday evening.
Thank you very much.
Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.